I was on my knees on the living room carpet when my lungs stopped obeying me. One moment there was air, the next, there was nothing, just a tight, burning pressure that made my chest feel smaller than my own ribs. I reached for my inhaler by instinct and realized it wasn't where it should have been. I looked up, vision tunneling, and saw my younger sister standing a few steps away, the blue plastic clutched in her hand like a toy she'd just decided not to share. She didn't look scared. She looked curious, almost amused. I tried to speak her name, but my throat locked. The sound that came out of me wasn't a word. It was a thin, broken gasp. My fingers scraped at the carpet as I dragged myself toward her nails, catching in the fibers, my whole body focused on one simple thing: air. She tilted her head, watching me the way people watch an animal struggle behind glass. "Gasp, loser," she said, smiling. Our parents were on the couch behind her. My mother glanced up from her magazine eyes, flicking from me to my sister and back again, as if weighing whether this interruption was worth her attention. My father didn't even turn his head. The television kept playing, the canned laughter bright and wrong in the room. No one moved. No one said my name. In that moment, as my chest convulsed and the edges of the room went dark, I understood something that would take me years to put into words. I could die right there on the floor of my own home, and it would be treated as an inconvenience. I was not panicking because I was dying. I was panicking because I was alone. I don't remember how long it lasted. Time did strange things after that. I remember the taste of dust. I remember the sound of my own breathing when it finally came back in ragged pieces. I remember the cold relief of air flooding my lungs and the hot, humiliating tears that followed. What I don't remember is anyone helping me. I survived that night by finding a backup inhaler buried in my bag, crawling for it while my family watched as if this were a lesson I needed to learn. No one ever mentioned it again. There was no apology, no argument, no explanation. The next morning, breakfast happened like always. My sister chatted about school. My mother asked if anyone wanted more coffee. My father folded his newspaper. It was as if the night before had been erased, wiped clean the way you wipe crumbs from a counter. I waited for someone to look at me differently, to ask if I was okay, to acknowledge that something terrible had happened. No one did. At first, I thought that was the strangest part, that my sister had done it, that my parents had watched. It took longer to understand that the silence afterward was worse. Life went on, but something had shifted. Conversations happened around me instead of with me. Decisions were made without my input, then explained later as afterthoughts. If I spoke up, I was told I was being dramatic. If I went quiet, it was proof that I was sulking. My sister learned quickly which version of the story to tell. She was easy. She was agreeable. She knew how to smile at the right moments. I learned how to disappear. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in small, deniable ways. A forgotten birthday dinner that was brushed off as a scheduling mix-up. A school event my parents missed because they thought it was on a different night. Praise for my sister's accomplishments delivered loudly at the table, while mine were acknowledged later privately, if at all. There was never one big thing I could point to and say, "This is when they chose her over me." There was just a steady accumulation of moments that taught me the same lesson over and over again. If I wanted peace, I had to be smaller. I stopped asking for things. I stopped correcting people when they got details about my life wrong. I stopped sharing plans in advance because they were often dismissed or forgotten. When relatives asked why they didn't see me as much, I was told later that I'd been busy, that I'd canceled, that I'd said I wasn't feeling well. I believed it was my fault for not trying harder, for not being easier to love. Looking back, I can see how efficient it was. No yelling, no punishments. Just a quiet system that made me question my own memory, my own reactions. If I felt hurt, I told myself I was overreacting. If I felt angry, I swallowed it. If I felt invisible, I assumed it was because I deserved to be. By the time I was old enough to leave, there was no dramatic blow-up. I didn't pack my bags in a fury or slam the door behind me. I simply went. I moved to another city with what I could fit in my car and told myself that distance would fix what closeness had broken. I thought leaving meant the story was over. I didn't know then that the night I couldn't breathe wasn't just a cruel moment. It was the first clear signal of a role I'd been assigned and a place I'd been moved out of. I didn't have the language for it yet. I only knew how it felt to realize at a very young age that survival in my family meant learning when to stop being seen. I would understand much later that nothing about that night was forgotten. It was simply filed away along with me. After that night, nothing changed on the surface. That was what made it so hard to explain even to myself. There was no family meeting, no hushed apology behind closed doors, no rule suddenly enforced. The house sounded the same. The routines stayed intact. My asthma attack became a non-event, something so insignificant, it didn't even earn a lie to cover it. I waited for someone to bring it up. I waited for my mother to ask if I needed a new inhaler, or for my father to make a joke that would let us all pretend it had been handled. Days passed, then weeks. The silence settled in thick and intentional, like furniture no one acknowledged, but everyone maneuvered around. My sister carried herself differently after that. Not guilty, not cautious, confident. She had learned something important, that there were no consequences for what she'd done. If anything, the absence of reaction seemed to embolden her. She spoke over me more often. She corrected me when I spoke even about my own experiences. If I protested, she rolled her eyes and told me to stop being so sensitive. My parents didn't defend her outright. They didn't have to. They perfected a more efficient response dismissal. If I mentioned feeling left out, my mother sighed as if exhausted by me. If I pointed out something unfair, my father told me I was imagining patterns that weren't there. They framed everything as concern. They were worried about me. I took things too personally. I needed to lighten up. That was the first lesson. If something hurt me, the problem was not the thing itself. The problem was my reaction to it. Life became a series of quiet adjustments. I learned to listen more than I spoke. I learned to rehearse sentences in my head before saying them, trimming away anything that might sound like complaint. When my sister spoke, my parents leaned in. When I spoke, they nodded absently, eyes already moving on to the next thing. At dinner, conversations flowed around me like water around a rock. Plans were made without my input, then announced as if I had been included all along. If I hesitated or asked a question, my mother frowned and said, "We talked about this even when I knew we hadn't." I started to doubt my own memory. I started keeping mental lists, replaying conversations late at night, trying to pinpoint where I had missed something. My sister's life expanded as mine contracted. Her schedule mattered. Her moods were monitored. Her disappointments were treated like emergencies. If she was upset, the whole house adjusted. If I was upset, it was evidence that I was difficult again. There was no single moment where I could say, "This is favoritism." That was the genius of it. Everything was small enough to deny. A forgotten errand. A comment brushed off. A praise withheld. Each incident alone was trivial. Together they formed a pattern I didn't yet know how to name. I tried to fix it by becoming easier. I offered help before being asked. I stayed out of the way. I laughed at jokes that made me uncomfortable. When relatives visited, I smiled and answered questions carefully, knowing that anything I said might be retold later without me present. I learned that my sister's version of events always traveled faster and landed better. Sometimes I caught glimpses of what was happening, moments when the curtain slipped. An aunt once asked why I never called anymore, her tone sharp with accusation. I was confused. I called all the time. Later, my mother told me she'd explained that I was busy, that I preferred my independence. I didn't want her to worry, she said, as if she'd done me a favor. Another time, a family friend congratulated my sister on something I had accomplished. When I gently corrected her, my sister laughed and said I was mistaken. My parents didn't intervene. The correction stood. I stood there smiling tightly, feeling something inside me loosen and drift away. The worst part wasn't being overlooked. It was being rewritten. I began to understand that there was a version of me circulating in the family that I didn't recognize. A version that was moody, unreliable, overly emotional. This version explained everything for them. It explained why my needs could be ignored, why my absence didn't raise concern, why my sister's behavior could be excused as patience running out. I internalized it. If people thought I was too much, then I needed to be less. If I felt angry, I told myself I was wrong to feel it. If I felt lonely, I assumed it was because I had failed to connect properly. I worked harder at shrinking than I ever had at growing. By the time I realized I was disappearing, it felt too late to stop it. I didn't know how to reclaim space without confirming the story they told about me. Every attempt to assert myself seemed to reinforce their belief that I was the problem. Silence became safer than truth. So when I finally left, it didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like relief. There was no dramatic announcement. I packed quietly. I chose a city far enough away to make surprise visits impossible. My parents accepted the news with polite interest. My sister hugged me, her smile practiced and shallow. No one asked how often I would come back. As I drove away, I told myself I was starting over. I believed distance would reset everything. I believed absence would create perspective. What I didn't understand then was that my disappearance solved something for them. It simplified their narrative. It removed an inconvenience. I thought they had stopped seeing me. I didn't yet know they had learned how to erase me. Distance gave me space, but it didn't give me answers. For a long time, that felt like enough. I built a life where no one interrupted my sentences, where silence meant rest instead of punishment. I chose work that rewarded focus and consistency, friends who didn't require me to perform gratitude for basic decency. On the surface, it looked like I had moved on. Underneath, something stayed unfinished. I told myself the past didn't matter anymore. I told myself that families were complicated, that everyone had their blind spots, that what happened when I was younger was unfortunate but not worth excavating. Whenever a memory surfaced uninvited, I labeled it unproductive and pushed it back down. I had learned very early that questioning the story came at a cost. The strange thing was how often the same moments returned. Not the dramatic ones, but the small, confusing gaps. A voicemail that was never returned. A holiday I hadn't been invited to, but later heard described as intimate and last minute. A cousin who greeted me with cool politeness as if we'd had an argument I couldn't remember. Each time I shrugged it off. People drift apart. Life gets busy. I was the one who left. That explanation worked until it didn't. It usually happened late at night when the noise of the day fell away, and there was nothing left to distract me. I would replay conversations in my head not with anger, but with a kind of clinical curiosity. Why had my mother used that exact phrase so often? Why did my sister's version of events always arrive before mine, already polished and accepted? Why did people seem so certain about things I knew were wrong? I started to notice the language. That was the first crack. You've always been sensitive. We didn't want to upset you. You know how you can be. Different people. Same sentences. Spoken years apart in different rooms with the same tone of patient concern. At first I thought it was coincidence. Families share expressions. Habits repeat. But the repetition was too precise. The phrases weren't just similar. They were identical down to the rhythm. Once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. I remembered my 16th birthday, the one that passed without comment. I had come home from school expecting at least a card. There was nothing. When I finally asked, my mother looked startled, then annoyed. "We thought you didn't want to fuss this year," she said. I remembered nodding, apologizing for the misunderstanding. Years later, I overheard her telling an aunt that I'd asked them not to do anything. The story had changed. I hadn't. I remembered my grandmother asking during one of our rare visits why I never called her anymore. The question had stung because I did call. Every week. When I mentioned this later, my mother waved it away. "She gets confused," she said gently. "You know how she is." I believed her. I didn't consider that confusion could be manufactured. I remembered a college acceptance letter that arrived already opened and then vanished from the kitchen counter. I had assumed I misplaced it. I remembered calling the admissions office in a panic, embarrassed to admit I didn't know my own status. When I told my parents I'd been accepted, they congratulated me politely as if it were news to them. I told myself I must have been mistaken about the letter. One memory alone meant nothing. Together they formed something else entirely. The shift was subtle but profound. I stopped asking myself why I hadn't tried harder and started asking who benefited from me believing that. I stopped framing the past as a series of accidents and began to see it as a sequence. Not random, not chaotic, ordered. It was unsettling not because it made me angry, but because it made everything make sense. I saw how doubt had been used like a leash. As long as I questioned my own reactions, I couldn't question anyone else's behavior. As long as I believed I was overreacting, I couldn't accuse anyone of underreacting. Confusion kept me quiet. Quiet kept the peace. There was a strange relief in recognizing it. For years I had carried the weight of being inherently difficult, of missing some essential social skill everyone else seemed to have. Now I understood that confusion can be taught. It can be reinforced. It can be useful. The realization didn't come with rage. It came with grief. I mourned the younger version of myself who tried so hard to be easier to love. I mourned the years I spent minimizing my needs because I thought that was maturity. I mourned the relationships that withered not because of distance, but because someone had been tending to that distance deliberately. What surprised me most was how calm I felt once the pattern snapped into focus. There was sadness, yes, but also clarity. The story I'd been telling myself for years, that I was unlucky, forgettable, inherently flawed, lost its grip. It had never been the full story. It had been a convenient one. That was when the impulse to verify took hold. If what I was seeing was real, there would be traces. Patterns leave marks. Words repeated for years don't disappear completely. Someone somewhere would remember something that didn't line up. I thought about old messages, half-remembered conversations, people who had drifted out of my life without explanation. For the first time, I considered the possibility that I wasn't the only one who had noticed. I picked up my phone, scrolled through contacts I hadn't touched in years, and stopped on a name that made my stomach tighten. An old friend. Someone who had seen pieces of my family dynamic from the outside. Someone who had never told me I was imagining things. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Reaching out meant risking confirmation of the worst. It meant turning suspicion into something solid. It meant stepping out of the comfortable uncertainty I'd lived in for years. But I also knew this: if the past had been orchestrated, then pretending it was random was no longer an option. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted to know if I was finally seeing clearly. I pressed call. The envelope arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that had no intention of changing my life. I came home from work, dropped my keys in the bowl by the door, and sorted the mail the way I always did: bills to the left, flyers to the trash, anything official set aside to open later. The return address caught my eye, only because it didn't belong to a bank or a utility company. It was formal, impersonal, printed in a typeface designed to discourage questions. I opened it, standing at the counter, still wearing my coat. At first, I didn't understand what I was reading. The language was stiff and procedural, full of words that didn't seem meant for me. I scanned it the way you scan instructions you assume don't apply. Then I saw my sister's name, not as a sender, not as a contact, as a party to a case. I read it again, slower this time. My name was there too. The notice informed me that I was being summoned in connection with a civil matter. I wasn't the plaintiff. I wasn't the defendant. I was listed as a material witness. The phrase felt heavy and absurd, like a costume that didn't fit. I hadn't spoken to my sister in years. I hadn't been part of her life, her work, her conflicts. Whatever she was involved in had nothing to do with me. It had to be a mistake. I sat down and reread the letter from the top. The case title meant nothing to me at first. Two names, one familiar, one not. My sister versus someone I didn't recognize. The court listed was real. The dates were specific. The instructions were unambiguous. I was required to respond, required to appear if called, required to participate. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was disbelief. For years, my family had acted as if I didn't exist. Now suddenly the law was insisting that I did. It felt less like an invitation, and more like a draft notice pulling me back into a system I had carefully exited. I checked the envelope again, half expecting it to dissolve into something less official if I looked closely enough. It didn't. I set the papers on the table and paced my apartment, trying to reconstruct how this could have happened. I hadn't been contacted beforehand. No one had asked for my consent or my recollection. There had been no warning, no tentative outreach disguised as concern. Just a legal document that treated my presence as a given. The strangest part was how calm the letter was. It didn't threaten. It didn't accuse. It simply stated that my involvement was necessary. That was when a colder thought surfaced. Necessary for whom I sat back down and read the document a third time, this time paying attention to the details I had skimmed before. The case involved allegations of defamation. My sister was claiming that someone had damaged her reputation with false statements. The unknown name belonged to a woman she was suing. The timeline spanned several years. My role was undefined, which somehow made it worse. I imagined my sister's voice confident and indignant, explaining how wronged she was. I imagined my parents nodding along, validating her outrage, reinforcing her certainty that she was the victim of something unfair. I did not imagine any version of this where I was consulted. My instinct was immediate and familiar. I needed to get out of this. I thought about ignoring the letter, about letting deadlines pass and pretending it had never arrived. I thought about hiring someone to respond on my behalf, to argue irrelevance, to assert distance. I had built an entire life around not being pulled into my family's orbit. I didn't owe them my time, my memories, or my presence. But the letter made one thing very clear. This wasn't a family request. It was a legal obligation. Silence would not make it disappear. That realization sat heavily in my chest. For years, distance had been my shield. Now distance was being treated as non-compliance. The idea of being forced back into a narrative I hadn't agreed to made my skin prickle. I wasn't afraid of seeing them. I was afraid of being folded back into the version of myself they had created. I looked again at the unfamiliar name in the case title. Rachel something. I didn't know her. But someone like her existed in my sister's life now. Someone my sister believed had wronged her badly enough to involve the courts. That alone was telling. My sister didn't tolerate challenges quietly. She escalated. She controlled the story. And now, apparently, she needed me. The thought lingered, unwelcome, but persistent. Why involve me at all? If this was truly about defamation, why drag in a sibling she had publicly distanced herself from? The answer I kept circling back to was not flattering. My absence had always served a purpose. Perhaps my presence would now serve another. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, as if neatness could impose order on what I was feeling. I told myself I would deal with it later. Tomorrow. Next week. I made dinner, turned on the television, went through the motions of a normal evening. But the letter sat on the table, visible from every angle. That night I lay awake, replaying its phrases in my head. Material witness. Required to appear. In connection with. The language was neutral, but the implication was not. Something my sister had set in motion had reached far enough to find me. By morning, one thing was clear. Avoidance wasn't going to protect me this time. Whatever story was unfolding, it had already made room for me without my permission. The door I had closed years ago hadn't stayed shut. It had just been waiting for the right moment to open backward. I read the letter again the next morning, slower this time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less invasive if I gave them enough attention. They didn't. What changed instead was the way my mind moved around them. I wasn't reading for reassurance anymore. I was reading for connections. Certain phrases tugged at memories I hadn't planned to revisit. Material witness, relevant history, prior knowledge. The language pulled the past forward not as nostalgia, but as context. I realized with a jolt that I wasn't remembering for emotional reasons. I was reviewing. That shift unsettled me more than the letter itself. I sat at my kitchen table and let the memories come, but I didn't let them wander. I took them one at a time, the way you examine pieces of something broken to see how they might once have fit together. I wasn't looking for pain. I was looking for repetition. The first thing I noticed was how often information had failed to reach me. Invitations that never arrived, messages that were supposedly sent but never received, decisions explained after they were already made. Each incident had felt minor on its own, easy to excuse. Now they lined up differently, less like accidents, and more like a method. I thought about my grandmother again. The way she used to ask, gently at first, and then with confusion why I never called anymore. The way my mother would smile and say I was busy, that I had a lot going on, that I valued my independence. I remembered feeling guilty for disappointing her, even though I hadn't changed my habits at all. I had kept calling. Someone had simply decided she didn't need to know. I remembered my 16th birthday, the empty calendar square where it should have been marked. I remembered my mother's explanation delivered with practiced concern. "We thought you didn't want attention this year." It sounded reasonable. It always had. What struck me now was how often that same reasoning appeared whenever something of mine was overlooked. It was never that they forgot. It was that I supposedly didn't want it. The language repeated itself everywhere once I started listening for it. "You're too sensitive. We didn't want to upset you. You misunderstand things." Different mouths, same sentences, same cadence. The realization landed quietly, but firmly. Independent people don't speak in unison unless they've been taught the lines. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting that sink in. For years, I had assumed my family shared opinions because they experienced me the same way. Now I saw another possibility. They experienced me the same way because they shared opinions. That distinction mattered. I thought about relationships that had faded without explanation. An aunt who used to call weekly then stopped. A cousin who grew distant after a visit, I remembered fondly. A family friend who once pulled me aside and asked if I was okay, then never followed up. At the time, I had blamed distance time my own lack of effort. I hadn't considered that stories travel when people don't. The question formed before I could stop it. Who benefited from my absence? I didn't like where that question led, but I followed it anyway. My sister's life had expanded as mine contracted. She was the reliable one, the devoted one, the daughter who showed up. My parents' narrative stayed clean and uncomplicated. There was no difficult middle child to explain, no conflicting accounts to manage. My disappearance made everything smoother. That didn't happen by accident. I felt a wave of something close to nausea as the pattern locked into place. It wasn't anger yet. It was the vertigo of realizing you've been standing on unstable ground for a very long time without knowing it. I had spent years trying to correct myself, to soften my edges, to adjust my expectations. All that effort had gone into solving a problem that was never actually mine. Confusion, I realized, had been useful. As long as I doubted my own perception, I couldn't challenge anyone else's version of events. As long as I believed I was the problem, the system stayed intact. I had mistaken my self-doubt for humility. It had been leverage. That understanding hurt in a different way than the memories themselves. It reframed everything. The silence after my asthma attack. The way no one talked about it. The way my sister's cruelty had been absorbed and normalized. None of it was random. It was consistent. I let myself grieve then quietly, without dramatics. I grieved for the younger version of myself who tried so hard to earn fairness. I grieved for the time I spent shrinking instead of asking harder questions. I grieved for the relationships that might have been different if the truth hadn't been redirected at every turn. What surprised me was the calm that followed. Once the pattern became clear, it lost its power to disorient me. There was sadness, yes, but also relief. I wasn't broken. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't failed some invisible test of family loyalty. I had been maneuvered. That realization brought with it a new instinct. If this had been deliberate, there would be traces. People who coordinate over years leave evidence behind even if they don't mean to. Stories repeated too often acquire seams. Someone somewhere would remember something that didn't match the official version. I thought about old messages about conversations that had ended abruptly, about people who had drifted out of my life without conflict. I thought about who had been present long enough to notice inconsistencies, who had known me well enough to question the narrative. One name kept resurfacing. An old friend from years ago, someone who had spent enough time around my family to see the dynamic without being inside it. Someone who had asked careful questions and listened to the answers. Someone who had never told me I was imagining things. I picked up my phone and stared at her name, my thumb hovering just above the screen. Reaching out felt risky. If she dismissed me, it would confirm the old story. If she agreed, it would change everything. I took a breath and reminded myself why I was doing this. Not for confrontation, not for revenge. I wanted to know if the pattern I finally saw existed outside my own head. I pressed call and waited, heart steady but alert, as the line rang. She answered on the third ring, her voice cautious but warm, as if she recognized my name before she recognized the moment it came from. We exchanged pleasantries that felt too thin for what I was about to ask. I told her I hoped the timing wasn't bad. She said it never was. That was the first thing that steadied me. I didn't start with accusations. I didn't even start with my family. I told her I'd received a legal notice involving my sister and that it had pulled up questions I couldn't ignore anymore. There was a pause on the line, not awkward, but deliberate. When she spoke again, she didn't tell me I was overthinking. She asked me what I needed to know. We met 2 days later at a quiet coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. She arrived early and chose a table tucked away from the windows. When I sat down, she studied my face for a moment, the way people do when they're checking for changes that matter. "You look steadier," she said. "Not happier, just clearer." I didn't know how she could see that, but I felt it too. I told her about the letter, about the phrases that kept repeating in my memory, about my growing suspicion that the past hadn't been as random as I'd believed. I watched her carefully as I spoke, bracing for the familiar, soft pushback, the well-meaning caution. It never came. Instead, she nodded. Slowly. Precisely. "I wondered when you'd call," she said. The words landed with more force than any denial could have. I asked her what she meant, and she took a breath, folding her hands together as if organizing years of thoughts before setting them down. She told me she'd noticed things back then. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to feel uneasy. The way conversations shifted when I left a room. The way my sister's stories about me arrived prepackaged, complete with explanations I'd never heard myself say. "I didn't know what to do with it," she said. "You seemed convinced it was normal, and I didn't want to interfere." She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder worn at the edges. She hesitated before opening it, giving me time to change my mind. I didn't. She slid it across the table. I kept things she said quietly, not because I planned to use them, because something felt wrong and I didn't trust it to disappear. Inside were copies of emails, notes she'd taken after visits, dates and times written in her careful handwriting. Nothing dramatic. No single piece that screamed abuse. What they showed instead was consistency. The same explanations given to different people. The same phrases I had just identified on my own. The same careful framing of me as unreliable, emotional, difficult. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with asthma. It wasn't panic, it was recognition. One note stopped me cold. It referenced a conversation with my mother shortly after my asthma attack. The wording was unmistakable. A casual mention that I had been acting out again, that I refused to come downstairs, that it was best not to make a fuss. The date matched. The description did not. I looked up at my friend, my hands steady despite the rush of heat in my face. She knew, I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. They all did. They just didn't agree on what mattered. As we went through the folder together, the shape of it became undeniable. This wasn't neglect. It was coordination. It wasn't one bad moment or one cruel decision. It was a system that rewarded silence and punished contradiction. The cruelty had been quiet, which made it easier to excuse and harder to name. The most damaging piece wasn't the volume of what she'd kept. It was the intent behind it. Notes about reminding relatives that I was sensitive. Emails about not telling certain people when I visited. A message that mentioned how much smoother things were when I wasn't involved. There it was in plain language. The benefit. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt strangely hollow, as if something heavy had finally been lifted and the space it left behind hadn't filled in yet. For years, I'd carried the weight of self-doubt, of assuming I was the common denominator in every misunderstanding. Seeing the pattern laid out like this didn't feel like vindication. It felt like clarity. My friend watched me carefully. "You don't have to do anything with this," she said. "I didn't keep it so you'd go to war. I kept it because I didn't want you to think you were alone if you ever started asking questions." That was when the shift happened. Not outside, but inside me. I realized I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I wasn't looking for someone to confirm my pain. I was looking at evidence that existed independently of how I felt about it. We talked about the legal case then, about what might matter and what might not. She explained what could be authenticated, what could be corroborated, what would hold up if scrutinized. There was no excitement in her voice, no sense of revenge, just practicality. When we finally stood to leave, she offered to make copies of everything to organize it if I needed. I accepted, not because I knew exactly what I would do with it, but because I understood something fundamental had changed. I wasn't carrying this alone anymore. Walking back to my car, the world felt sharper edges, more defined. The air was cool, clean. I breathed deeply, testing the sensation. It felt different, not because the past had changed, but because my position in relation to it had. Someone had kept the truth long enough for me to be ready to see it. And now that I had, I knew one thing with certainty. I was never the problem. I spent that night sitting on the floor of my apartment, the folder open in front of me, the pages spread out like pieces of a map I had been trying to draw from memory for years. I didn't read them all at once. I couldn't. I picked one up, set it down, stared at the wall, then reached for another. My body was still, but my mind was racing in a way it hadn't since I was young. Validation didn't feel the way I'd imagined it might. There was no surge of triumph, no sense of being proven right in a satisfying way. What I felt instead was disorientation. The ground I'd been standing on for most of my life had shifted, and even though the new ground was solid, I needed time to find my balance. I asked myself a question I'd never allowed before. Not what had they done to me, but why? Why go to such lengths? Why the repetition, the consistency, the careful wording? Neglect is lazy. Favoritism can be sloppy. What I was looking at was neither. It was maintained. It was corrected when it drifted. It was reinforced over time. I followed the benefit trail the way you follow a stream to see where it leads. My absence had smoothed everything. My sister had been able to occupy a single role without competition. My parents didn't have to reconcile conflicting versions of events or explain why one child experienced the family differently. There was one story, one direction, one image presented to the outside world. And I complicated that image simply by existing. That realization hit harder than any individual memory. I hadn't been excluded because I was difficult. I had been labeled difficult because exclusion required justification. Once that label stuck, everything else fell neatly into place. My reactions could be dismissed. My silence could be interpreted. My absence could be framed as choice. I wasn't forgotten. I was managed. I saw the role I had been assigned with unsettling clarity. The sensitive one, the emotional one, the unreliable narrator of her own life. It was a role that required no direct confrontation. It allowed them to explain away any discomfort I caused without examining their own behavior. And once it was established, it was self-sustaining. I thought about all the times I'd tried to be better, quieter, more agreeable. All the times I'd apologized for being upset instead of asking why I was upset in the first place. I had spent years negotiating with a system that had no intention of letting me win. Every attempt to fix myself had only reinforced the story that I was the problem. The hardest truth to face wasn't my sister's cruelty. It was my parents' intent. I had clung to the idea that they were passive, that they didn't notice that they were overwhelmed or distracted. The notes and messages in front of me made that impossible to maintain. They hadn't missed what was happening. They had directed it. They had coached the narrative, smoothed over inconsistencies, and rewarded behavior that aligned with their goals. Their silence hadn't been weakness. It had been strategy. That understanding brought a different kind of grief. Not the sharp pain of betrayal, but the slow ache of losing something you thought you had. I grieved the parents I believed existed beneath the behavior, the ones who might have stepped in if they'd known better. I grieved the idea that if I had just explained myself more clearly, things could have been different. They had known, and they had chosen. I let myself feel that fully without rushing past it. I mourned the child who learned to doubt her own perception. I mourned the years spent trying to earn fairness from people who benefited from withholding it. I mourned the family I thought I had, and the one I never did. What I didn't feel was a desire to go back. Something essential had shifted. The guilt I'd carried for years loosened its grip, and in its place was a steady, grounded anger that didn't ask to be acted on immediately. It didn't need to explode. It simply clarified boundaries. I wasn't responsible for repairing what I hadn't broken. For the first time, I understood why self-doubt had been such a useful tool. As long as I questioned myself, I didn't question them. As long as I believed I was inherently flawed, I didn't look for external explanations. My confusion had kept me compliant. My compliance had kept the system intact. Seeing that didn't make me feel powerful right away. It made me feel sober. I gathered the papers and stacked them neatly, a small act of order that felt symbolic. These weren't memories anymore. They were records. They existed whether I wanted them to or not, whether my family acknowledged them or not. I realized then that the balance had shifted, quietly but decisively. The story I'd been living inside for years was no longer the only version available. The evidence didn't care about tone or intention or hurt feelings. It cared about patterns, dates, repetition. And patterns are hard to argue with. I sat back against the couch and closed my eyes, letting the weight of that settle. I didn't plan revenge. I didn't rehearse confrontations. I didn't imagine dramatic scenes where everything was finally said out loud. What I felt instead was resolve. I would stop running, not toward them, but away from the fear of being seen clearly. If my presence had always been treated as a problem, then removing myself had been a temporary solution at best. The truth had followed me anyway. Now it was asking to be acknowledged. I opened my eyes and looked at the folder one last time before placing it carefully in my desk drawer. I didn't know exactly what would happen next. I didn't know how the legal case would unfold or what role I would be asked to play. But I knew this. If they had built their version of the future by pushing me out of the picture, then the truth would have to put me back in the room. Avoidance had kept me alive for a long time. I didn't shame myself for that anymore. Distance had given me room to breathe, to build something stable, to learn who I was without the constant pressure of being evaluated. But the letter on my table and the folder in my drawer made one thing clear. Avoidance was no longer protection. It was exposure. If I stayed silent now, I wouldn't be opting out. I would be opting in to whatever story continued without me. I didn't wake up that morning craving confrontation. I woke up with a quiet certainty that surprised me. The dread I expected wasn't there. In its place was a steady focus, the kind that shows up when a decision has already been made somewhere deeper than thought. I wasn't doing this for revenge. That distinction mattered. Revenge is noisy. It burns fast and leaves collateral damage behind. I wasn't interested in punishment or humiliation or proving anything through spectacle. What I wanted was simpler and harder. I wanted to participate. I wanted facts to exist where silence had been. I wanted the truth to stand without my having to decorate it with emotion. I started with the practical steps, because that was how I calmed myself. I read the case file more carefully, highlighting dates and names, noting what was relevant and what wasn't. I learned the difference between what felt important and what actually mattered in a legal setting. Feelings didn't count. Patterns did. Documentation did. Consistency did. There was something grounding about that. For once, my experience didn't need to be convincing. It just needed to be accurate. I reached out to a legal advisor recommended by a colleague, someone who didn't know my family and didn't need to. I explained my position in neutral terms, stripped of history and resentment. She listened, asked precise questions, and told me plainly that my involvement was not incidental. My testimony and any supporting material could influence the case significantly. "This isn't a family discussion," she said. "It's a matter of record." That sentence stayed with me. For years, everything that happened to me had been dismissed as family drama, the kind of thing people roll their eyes at and tell you to move on from. Hearing it reframed as record, as something that existed outside private narratives, shifted my posture. I wasn't walking into an emotional ambush. I was stepping into a process. I thought about how my family would respond when they saw me again. I knew the patterns well enough to predict them. My sister would default to confidence, to charm, to indignation. My parents would present calm concern, the image of reasonableness they'd always relied on. There would be subtle attempts to minimize, to suggest misunderstanding, to position me as overly sensitive or motivated by old grievances. I prepared for that, not by rehearsing arguments, but by practicing restraint. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and spoke aloud, testing my own voice. I described events plainly, without qualifiers, without apologies. I noticed how often I wanted to soften my words to preemptively explain myself. Each time I stopped. Facts didn't need cushioning. The urge to make myself palatable was an old reflex. I didn't need it anymore. What surprised me was the calm that settled in as I did this. It wasn't numbness. It was alignment. For the first time, what I knew matched how I was prepared to speak. There was no gap to manage, no version of myself to maintain for someone else's comfort. The days leading up to the hearing passed quietly. I went to work. I answered emails. I cooked dinner. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had sharpened. I noticed details more. I slept more deeply. I felt present in my body in a way I hadn't in years. The night before I was scheduled to travel, I packed without rushing. I laid out clothes that felt like me, not armor and not disguise. I placed the folder carefully in my bag, checking it twice, then set it aside. When I closed my apartment door behind me the next morning, I felt the weight of the moment, not fear, but significance. At the airport, surrounded by strangers moving in practiced patterns, I felt oddly anonymous and grounded. No one knew my history. No one was watching for cues. I was just another person in transit carrying something important that couldn't be seen from the outside. On the plane, I looked out the window as the city fell away beneath me. I thought about all the rooms I had left quietly over the years, all the exits I had taken without ceremony. Leaving had always felt like the only power available to me. This time was different. When I landed, the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. I picked up my bag and followed the signs toward ground transportation, my steps steady. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was ready to stand still. By the time I reached my hotel, the sense of inevitability had settled fully. Whatever happened next would happen with me present. No more secondhand accounts, No more stories told without my voice in the room. That night, I stood by the window and watched the lights of an unfamiliar city flicker on one by one. I placed my hand on the glass and took a slow, deliberate breath. My chest expanded easily. My lungs cooperated. I had spent years leaving rooms to survive. This time I was walking into one. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where voices naturally lowered themselves without being asked. My footsteps echoed more than I expected as I passed through security and followed the signs down a long hallway. The air felt cooler there, steady and impersonal, as if emotion had been bled out of the walls years ago and replaced with procedure. I spotted them before they saw me. My sister sat at the plaintiff's table, posture straight, shoulders relaxed, her confidence arranged as carefully as her blazer. She looked exactly like someone who believed she was in control. My parents were seated behind her, close enough to signal unity, far enough back to maintain plausible distance. They were dressed the way they always dressed when appearances mattered. Calm, respectable, untroubled. For a moment, an old instinct flickered in me, the urge to shrink, to take up less space, to prepare for dismissal. It passed almost immediately. I was no longer entering a family room. I was entering a neutral one. My sister's eyes found me then. Her expression shifted into something familiar, a look I had seen 100 times growing up. Not surprise, not concern. Contempt softened by certainty. The look that said she already knew who I was in this story. My parents reacted more subtly. My mother's gaze slid over me without stopping, as if I were a coat rack she'd passed 1,000 times before. My father nodded once politely, a gesture that carried no invitation. They still believed the version of me they'd preserved would show up if needed. Quiet, uncertain, grateful for scraps of acknowledgement. They had no idea how outdated that belief was. I took a seat where I'd been directed and placed my bag at my feet. Around me, papers were shuffled, low conversations exchanged. Lawyers conferred in murmurs, their movements efficient and unhurried. No one paid me special attention, and I was grateful for that. I didn't need to be noticed yet. As we waited, I found myself studying my sister with a detached curiosity. She leaned in to speak to her attorney, gesturing lightly, her tone animated but controlled. She laughed once, a quick, dismissive sound. I recognized the performance. I had grown up watching it. Confidence, when practiced long enough, becomes reflex. She was prepared for a narrative, not for resistance. I knew the story she expected to tell. I could recite it from memory. A vindictive former associate, false statements, damage to reputation. And somewhere in the background, a difficult sibling who had distanced herself by choice, who held grudges, who couldn't be trusted to interpret events accurately. If my name came up at all, it would be as a footnote, a complication, something unfortunate but irrelevant. I let them believe that. Silence felt different now. It wasn't imposed, it was chosen. I didn't correct their assumptions or meet their eyes too long. I didn't brace myself to defend my worth. I sat still and waited. For once, time was on my side. When the judge entered the room, rose as one. She was composed, businesslike, her expression unreadable. The formalities unfolded with practiced rhythm. Case number, parties present, procedural notes delivered without inflection. This was not a space for drama, and I felt a quiet appreciation for that. As the proceedings began, my sister's confidence remained intact. She spoke when prompted, her voice clear, her phrasing smooth. She was convincing in the way people are when they've rehearsed a story long enough to believe it themselves. My parents watched her closely, their faces arranged into expressions of concern and support. They had perfected this choreography over years. I noticed something else, though. A tension beneath the surface. A slight stiffness in my sister's shoulders when certain questions were asked. A flicker of impatience when answers didn't land immediately. Confidence relies on predictability. She was comfortable only as long as the room followed her expectations. I stayed quiet. The judge listened, occasionally interjecting with clarifying questions. Notes were taken. Exhibits were referenced, but not yet introduced. The pace was deliberate, controlled. I felt the weight of the folder in my bag, a physical reminder of how much the narrative depended on what had not yet been said. At one point, my sister glanced back at me again, her brow creasing slightly. It was the first sign of uncertainty. She was checking, measuring, trying to read something on my face. I gave her nothing. The version of me she remembered would have looked away by now. I didn't. The realization seemed to unsettle her more than open defiance would have. As the morning progressed, the judge announced the next phase of the proceedings. Evidence would be reviewed. Materials submitted by both sides would be examined before testimony continued. The words were neutral, procedural, almost dull. But the effect in the room was immediate. I felt it like a shift in air pressure. My sister's attorney straightened, gathering documents with renewed focus. My sister nodded, her expression tightening just a fraction. My parents leaned closer together, their earlier ease replaced by something watchful. They still believed the structure favored them. They trusted the momentum they had built. I understood then how completely they underestimated what was coming. Not because they were careless, but because they were used to silence working in their favor. They were used to stories that went unchallenged. They were used to me being absent or present only in ways they could manage. The judge's voice cut cleanly through the room as she outlined the order in which materials would be presented. Her tone did not change when she mentioned video evidence. She did not look at me when she spoke. She didn't need to. I sat back slightly in my chair, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing slow and even. There was no urge to rush the moment, no impatience. Timing mattered. I had waited years to understand what had been done to me. I could wait a little longer to let the truth arrive on its own terms. They had brought confidence into that room, polished and rehearsed. They were about to meet proof. The judge adjusted her glasses and spoke in the same even tone she had used all morning. Before we proceed further, she said the court will review the evidence submitted by the defense. There was no drama in her voice, no hint of what was coming, just procedure. The first exhibit was introduced without ceremony. Dates, correspondence. A timeline laid out cleanly on the screen at the front of the room. It established who was present, and when, nothing more. My sister watched with polite interest, her posture unchanged. This was the kind of evidence she understood how to navigate. Context could be argued. Interpretation could be managed. Then the judge nodded to the clerk. "Play the video." The room went quiet in a way that felt absolute. Not the expectant hush of a performance, but the kind of silence that happens when people sense something irreversible is about to occur. The screen flickered once, then steadied. I didn't look at it right away. I focused instead on the sound. My own breathing filled the courtroom, thin and broken, unmistakable. A teenage girl gasping for air on a living room floor. The microphone picked up every rasp, every desperate inhale that didn't quite make it. I felt my chest tighten in sympathy, but I kept my eyes forward. Then my sister's voice came through the speakers. Clear, young, mocking, gasp, loser. There was no mistaking it, no ambiguity to soften. The words landed heavy in the room, stripped of context, stripped of excuse. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Someone inhaled sharply. I heard a chair creak as a body leaned back instinctively, creating distance from what they were witnessing. On the screen, my younger self crawled across the carpet, fingers clawing forward. The inhaler was visible in my sister's hand, held just out of reach. The camera angle didn't move. It had been positioned deliberately. Someone had wanted to capture every second. I kept my gaze steady, refusing to look at the screen. I didn't need to see it again. I knew exactly what was there. What mattered now was that everyone else did too. My sister made a sound low and involuntary, something between a gasp and a protest. She half rose from her chair, then sat back down, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her composure fractured visibly like glass cracking under pressure. She turned toward our parents, her face searching, panicked. My mother's face had gone pale. The careful expression she wore in public slipped, revealing something raw underneath shock-fear recognition. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at nothing. The video ended. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The judge let it sit. She didn't rush to fill the space, didn't offer commentary or reassurance. She allowed the evidence to occupy the room on its own terms. When she finally spoke again, her voice was controlled, but something in it had shifted. "The court will now review the accompanying materials," she said. The next exhibit appeared, this one less visceral, but no less damaging. Messages, notes, records that showed repetition over time. The same phrases used in different contexts. The same framing of events. A pattern emerging undeniable in its consistency. Neglect reframed as concern. Cruelty softened into misunderstanding. Silence repackaged as discretion. My sister shook her head, whispering something to her attorney. Her earlier confidence was gone, replaced by frantic calculation. She was no longer performing. She was reacting. My parents sat rigid, their earlier unity dissolving into separate, isolated stillness. At one point, my sister stood up abruptly. This is being taken out of context," she said, her voice breaking. "That video doesn't show." "Sit down," the judge said, not unkindly but firmly. The authority in those two words cut through the room. My sister sank back into her chair, her hands trembling now, her breathing shallow. The narrative she had relied on for so long was collapsing under the weight of its own documentation. I was asked to confirm a date, a location, a fact. I answered plainly without elaboration. I didn't explain how it felt. I didn't describe the aftermath. I didn't accuse anyone of intent. The record spoke for itself. As I spoke, I became aware of how different this moment was from every confrontation I had imagined over the years. There was no shouting, no emotional plea, no desperate need to be believed. Belief was no longer required. Verification was enough. The judge nodded, satisfied, and made a note. "The court recognizes the relevance of this evidence," she said. "It will be entered into the record." Entered into the record. The words echoed quietly in my mind. For years, what happened to me had existed only in memory, easily dismissed, easily rewritten. Now it existed somewhere else, somewhere permanent. My sister's attorney attempted to regain footing, asking questions that felt suddenly flimsy, grasping at explanations that no longer held. Each attempt only emphasized what had already been made clear. The truth didn't argue back. It didn't need to. I watched my sister as the reality settled in. The realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding she could charm her way out of. That this wasn't a private family matter she could minimize. That the version of herself she had carefully maintained was now being examined without her consent. She started to cry, then sharp, desperate sobs that startled the room. My mother reached for her automatically, then hesitated, her hand hovering uselessly in the air. For the first time, I saw uncertainty ripple through them both. I felt nothing but a deep, steady calm. The judge called for a brief recess. People stood, murmurs breaking out in low waves. I remained seated, my hands folded, my breathing even. The moment I had spent years avoiding had arrived, and it was quieter than I ever expected. They had built their certainty on silence. Silence was no longer available to them. When the recess ended, the room felt altered in a way I couldn't quite name. It wasn't louder or quieter. It was heavier, as if something invisible had been set down in the center of it, and everyone was now forced to walk around the weight. People avoided each other's eyes. Conversations happened in murmurs that didn't travel far. The judge returned and resumed the proceedings without comment on what had just been shown. She didn't need to. The evidence had done what words rarely can. It had removed interpretation from the equation. What followed was procedural, careful, deliberate. The kind of work that looks unremarkable from the outside but changes outcomes forever. The court acknowledged the materials formally, the video, the records, the documented pattern. Each piece was referenced by number, not emotion. Each was entered into the record with the same calm authority. Nothing about it felt theatrical, and that made it worse for the people who had relied on performance. I watched my sister struggle to regain control of herself. She dabbed at her eyes, straightened her blazer, whispered urgently to her attorney. The confidence she'd walked in with didn't return. In its place was something frantic and brittle. She was no longer steering the story. She was trying to survive it. My parents sat apart now, not physically, but in posture. My mother's shoulders were rounded, her hands clenched in her lap. She stared straight ahead, blinking too slowly, as if she were bracing against something internal. My father looked smaller somehow, his earlier composure replaced by a fixed, distant stare. He didn't move when my sister reached back toward him. The image they had curated for decades was cracking in real time. The judge outlined the implications clearly. The evidence materially affected the credibility of the claims before the court. It raised serious questions about intent pattern and truthfulness. Further review would be required. Additional filings would be considered. There was no gavel slam, no dramatic declaration, just a shift in direction that could not be undone. I felt it settle into my bones. As the hearing continued, it became clear that what had been dismissed as personal history was now something else entirely. Staff members glanced at one another. Attorneys took notes more quickly. The tone of the room changed from assumption to assessment. Whatever outcome the case would ultimately reach, the narrative my sister had built was no longer intact. The consequences began quietly. People who had smiled politely at my sister earlier now looked at her with careful neutrality. Court staff addressed her with professional distance. The gallery, small as it was, carried the weight of what it had witnessed out into the hallway during the next break. I heard fragments of conversation as I stepped outside to get water. Disbelief, discomfort, recognition. What had once been framed as family drama had crossed a line into public record. When the judge adjourned for the day, the room emptied slowly. My sister stood up too fast, knocking her chair back with a sharp scrape that drew attention she clearly didn't want. She avoided my gaze, her face tight, her jaw clenched. My parents followed behind her, their movements stiff and uncoordinated, as if they weren't quite sure where to stand anymore. No one spoke to me. That felt right. I walked out of the courthouse into late afternoon light that seemed too bright after hours indoors. The air was cool, clean, and different. I took a deep breath and noticed with some surprise that my chest felt loose. There was no knot there, no pressure, just space. Over the next few days, the effects of what had happened rippled outward in ways I didn't orchestrate and couldn't have stopped if I wanted to. Legal conversations shifted tone. Emails arrived that were more careful, more formal. My sister's case, once so confidently framed, became complicated, unstable. The court's questions multiplied. People began to read the record. What had been hidden behind closed doors for years was now accessible, factual, undeniable. My sister's reputation, built on charm and certainty, began to fracture under scrutiny. Associations she'd relied on grew distant. Professional inquiries followed. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. Instead, there was a steady erosion. Karma, I learned, is not loud. I noticed what I didn't feel. There was no urge to call anyone, no desire to confront my parents in the hallway or demand explanations. No satisfaction in watching my sister unravel. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Finished carrying something that was never mine to hold. There were attempts, of course. A message left on my phone that I didn't return. An email sent late at night, heavy with implication and urgency. I read it once, noted the familiar language, and closed it. Boundaries didn't require speeches. They required consistency. For years, I had believed that distance was my only defense. Now I understood something else. Distance without truth is fragile. Truth, once established, holds its ground without effort. The day the court formally noted that the evidence would stand as part of the record, I felt a quiet click inside me, like a lock turning. That was the moment I knew the story had turned for good. Not because of a verdict or a ruling, but because the distortion had been removed. They could no longer tell their version without resistance. I walked through my apartment that evening, noticing small things I'd taken for granted. The way the light fell across the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. My life, the one I had built away from them, felt intact and untouched by the chaos unfolding elsewhere. The truth hadn't destroyed anything I valued. It had simply ended the story that was never mine to begin with. The noise didn't end all at once. It faded in layers. Courtrooms emptied, emails slowed, names stopped appearing in my notifications. One evening, weeks after everything had settled into its new shape, I stood by my open window and realized my shoulders were no longer hunched. I hadn't noticed when that tension left. I only noticed its absence. For the first time in as long as I could remember, breathing felt like a neutral act instead of a test. I didn't get the things people expect after a story like this. There was no apology that mattered, no family meeting where wrongs were named and repaired, no sudden warmth where there had been years of cold. That part of the story never arrived, and I stopped waiting for it. What I got instead was clarity. I understood finally what had been lost and what had never existed to begin with. I hadn't lost a family that once saw me. I had lost access to a story that was never willing to make room for me. The difference mattered. Grieving the first would have kept me tethered to hope that had already proven itself unreliable. Accepting the second set me free. For a long time, I thought closure meant agreement, that it required everyone involved to acknowledge the same truth at the same time. I know better now. Closure doesn't require consensus. It requires honesty, sometimes only your own. The label they gave me all those years ago fell apart once I stopped carrying it. I wasn't difficult. I wasn't too sensitive. I wasn't imagining patterns that didn't exist. I was inconvenient to a system that depended on my silence, and that distinction changed everything about how I saw myself. Justice didn't arrive as punishment. It arrived as alignment. Facts finally matched reality. The past stopped shifting under my feet. I didn't need anyone to be humiliated or destroyed to feel whole. I needed the distortion removed. Once it was, the rest took care of itself. The asthma never disappeared. I still carry my inhaler. I still know what it feels like when my chest tightens unexpectedly. But breathing means something different now. It isn't just survival. It's ownership. I decide who gets access to my life, my time, my voice. I learned that family is not defined by shared blood or shared history. It's defined by who refuses to make you disappear, by who sees you clearly and stays. Anything else is just proximity dressed up as obligation. There are days when the grief returns in small, manageable waves. Grief for the girl who tried so hard to be easier. Grief for the years spent shrinking to keep the peace. I let those feelings pass through me now instead of fighting them. They don't define me anymore. They inform me. Most days, though, I feel steady. I wake up in a life that doesn't require translation. I speak without rehearsing. I rest without guilt. I move through the world knowing that if someone misunderstands me now, it won't be because I failed to explain myself. It will be because they chose not to listen. And that is no longer my burden to carry. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. You're not imagining it. Patterns don't repeat themselves for decades by accident. Confusion is often taught. Silence is often rewarded. And being labeled the problem is sometimes the easiest way to avoid looking at the system itself. You're allowed to protect yourself. You're allowed to step back. You're allowed to tell the truth even if your voice shakes. And you're allowed to stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. If this story touched something in you, I'd really love to hear from you. You can share your thoughts, your experience, or even just a few words in the comments. You never know who else might be reading and realize they're not alone for the first time. And if you want to stay with us for more stories like this, stories about truth, quiet strength, and reclaiming your voice, you're welcome here. Subscribing isn't about a button. It's about choosing to stay in a space where your story is taken seriously. I spent years thinking survival meant leaving rooms quietly. Now I know survival can also mean staying present, breathing freely, and letting the truth stand without apology. If you're still waiting to be seen, your turn is coming. You were never invisible.